I've always been looked at as a nice kid, the patient, timid, caring guy. And I would like to believe all of that to be true. But honestly, a lot of that could also be due to the fact that I've never had a lot of confidence. I'm 18 years old now, and this lack of confidence has given me a lot of problems throughout my life so far. It's like the other kids at school can sense it. Kids can be so cruel. When I was younger, I suffered a lot. I can distinctly remember when I first began dreading having to go to school. It was in 2nd grade. There was a kid named Ricky in my grade. He was the poor kid at school. His family didn't have any money. His clothes were always outdated and usually pretty dirty. They were most certainly hand-me-downs or obtained from a thrift store. His hair was unkempt and desperately needed cut. Even as an 8-year-old, I felt real sympathy for this kid. But like I said, kids can be so cruel. Because of Ricky's unfortunate home life, he instantly became a target to the other kids. Most of the bullying Ricky received came in the form of generic insults from some of the other kids. They made fun of his clothes, said his family didn't own a bathtub, came up with various crazy stories why Ricky's parents were poor. It went on and on. It always bothered me a bit. I didn't like seeing someone else being picked on. I knew it hurt his feelings. My family life wasn't exactly perfect. My dad died in an accident when I was only a year old. I have an older brother, Rob, who was 4 years older than me, so we were never at the same school at the same time, but we were still close. Then there was my mom. She was loving and hardworking. She didn't have a great job, and our family struggled too, but she always got what Rob and I needed. She kept us in new clothes and fed us well. She gave us a decent place to live with some decent things in it. She was always our rock, and she somehow made it work. But I knew what it was like to basically have the bare minimum. We weren't all that much better off than Ricky and his family. But even more than that, I could see what the bullying did to him. Once a vibrant and playful kid in kindergarten, was now withdrawn only 2 years later. He really didn't have any friends. At this point, now in 2nd grade, people were beginning to form groups, or cliques, and he wasn't part of any of them. But if that wasn't bad enough, the other kids had to go out of their way to torment him. At this point, I get it. Kids are insecure. They're looking for the approval of their peers. They are trying to impress them. They are trying to be the cool kids that the other ones look up to. But it almost always comes back to them not feeling good enough about themselves to begin with. Of course, as kids, none of us knew this. Everyone seemed to think the bullies were the cool kids. They were the funny kids, the ones with power, the leaders. But in reality, they were none of those things. If only kids knew what they were doing. If only they knew what kind of damage bullying had on other kids. I mean this nicely, but kids are just kind of stupid. I'm about to graduate, and looking back, we were just kind of dumb and naive to what the real world was. Things eventually only got worse for Ricky. He would always sit alone during lunch at school, as there were always several unused tables. No one would ever allow him to eat lunch with them. I would have, but some of the kids I sat with at lunch, that I once considered to be my friends, would not have allowed it. No one wanted to be labeled as his friend. Eventually the jokes aimed at Ricky turned into taunting from across the halls and lunchroom. It continued to evolve. Kids then began throwing things at Ricky during lunch. He would just do his best to ignore them. One day, one of the main bullies, John, walked up to Ricky during lunch, picked up his chocolate milk, and dumped it right on his head. Ricky went home early that day. Ricky knew he couldn't retaliate. It was practically him against the world. Or at least it must have felt like that to him at the time. Another day, while Ricky was eating his lunch, John did something else. This really upset me. I knew Ricky didn't eat enough due to his situation at home. Sometimes he would just sit during lunch with his head down, eating nothing at all. One day, he pulled a small brown sack out of his old, dirty-looking book bag. As he began to unravel the brown bag, John came up behind him, grabbed the bag from his hands, started smashing what was inside of it with his hands, and threw it in the trash. All Ricky did was get up and run out of the cafeteria. My heart sank and I felt genuine sadness for him. I quietly snuck out of the cafeteria and began to look for him. After a couple minutes of searching, I eventually found him sitting in one of the stalls of the boys' bathroom at the far end of the school. "Hey Ricky, it's Mark," I said apprehensively. I could hear him in the stall, crying quietly to himself. He didn't reply. I was looking down at his old, tattered shoes. I began to think about how old those shoes were. Who else previously owned those shoes? Where they've been and what they've seen. I came back into reality of the situation and walked closer to the stall he was in. I wasn't sure what to do. I just wanted to somehow make him feel better. Make him feel that someone, anyone, cared about him. I also brought him my sandwich and a pack of cookies which weren't open yet. I could afford to skip a meal, and I thought it would probably be a better meal than he's had lately. Once I was standing in front of the stall he was in, I asked him, "Ricky, is it okay if I come in?" Again, he didn't reply to me. Although I've never done anything to him personally, he probably didn't trust me. I'm sure at this point, he didn't trust any of the kids at school. I pushed lightly on the door to check if it was locked. It pushed open slightly. I then opened it far enough so I could peek my head in. Ricky was just sitting there on the toilet, with his head in his hands, lightly crying. Once he could sense I was standing in front of him, he began wiping his face with his sleeves. He didn't look up, but finally, he let out a weak, I'm fine. I just want to be alone." I told him, "Okay, Ricky, but just take this." I handed him the food. After a few seconds, he took it out of my hands. It was at that point that he finally slowly looked up at me. He had a look of both confusion and surprise. I'm sure part of him had to feel that I could possibly be playing some type of terrible joke on him, but I think he was able to sense the sincerity of the gesture. Giving him the food actually made me feel even more sad than I previously was. I could tell by his reaction to the event that it was incredibly rare for someone to do something kind for him. I began to wonder what his home life was really like, but quickly got the thoughts out of my mind. I gave him a sympathetic smile and walked out, respecting his wishes. It was that day, at that moment, that I really began to understand and appreciate the severity of Ricky's situation. Time continued forward, and not to my surprise, the bullies continued to torment Ricky. I was definitely not one of the cool kids. I was one of those kids that just kind of flew under the radar. Not a complete nerd, but also not popular by any means. So there was really nothing I could do to help Ricky out. I didn't have any influence over the bullies. They barely even knew I existed. Things just got worse and worse. I walked around with a sense of guilt and remorse for what the poor kid was going through every day. One day, I walked into school in the morning, and after going through the doors and rounding the corner, I saw Ricky. He was walking by himself. About 1 second after seeing him, I then saw John. I resented that kid. He was a little taller than most boys our age. He played sports and was great at all of them. He was decent looking and his parents were well off, but all of that wasn't good enough for him. No, he still felt the need to be a bully. Instead of using all of the many, many gifts he was given in life to help or inspire others, he decided he would torment others for his own pleasure. Ricky was minding his own business, walking with his head down. As soon as I spotted John, it was too late. Ricky never even saw it coming. John blindsided him out of nowhere, practically tackling him into the lockers. Ricky hit into the lockers with a startling force. He immediately went down into the fetal position and covered his head with his hands. John and his friends, all laughing, ran off to avoid getting in trouble. Not that the golden child John could actually get into trouble. He had the best facade I've ever seen, convincing all the teachers he was such a sweet boy. Regardless, he was good at sports and his parents had money. Either of those, or especially both, are the formula for getting through school easy, regardless of your behavior. It's pretty sad how true that actually is. And these days, school officials talk about how serious of an issue bullying is, and yet, nothing seems to ever change. Always raising awareness, never taking action. I ran up to Ricky to check on him. I knelt down next to him and put my hand on his back. He jumped a bit as soon as I touched him, but I assured him it was me and that he was safe now. I sat there with him for a minute. I asked him if he was okay. He just shook his head yes. Eventually he stood up and just walked off to go about his business, as if nothing happened. For some reason, that angered me more than anything. How in the world is it okay that someone completely innocent can be treated in such a way, and then just have to walk off and accept it? He never did anything wrong to them. He didn't instigate anything. He was given a bad hand in life. He should have been helped out by the other students because of it, not tortured. He might be willing to accept what happened to him, but I wasn't. I decided I had to take action. I didn't care what possible backlash there might be. I was going to the principal, and I was telling them everything. I knew that John was going to get in a lot of trouble, and he deserved it. I walked into the main office at school. The receptionist was on the phone. She signaled me to wait by looking up at me and putting her index finger up. The bell rang, and I heard students scuffling down the hallway, trying to make it to class on time. But not me. I had to help Ricky out of this situation he was in. Finally, the receptionist asked me what I needed. I told her it was urgent that I talk to the principal. She asked why, and I told her it was private. Why did she need to know anyway? Reluctantly, she told me to take a seat and she would let him know I was there. I sat there, reminding myself of every incident of John and his friends bullying Ricky. I wasn't going to forget to mention anything. Finally, I was called back and sat before the principal. "Mr. Adams, what urgent matter brings you in today?" he said. He didn't seem to have a lot of genuine interest in his voice, but he would once I told him everything that had been going on. I put it all out there, everything. I made sure not to miss any part of it. His reply simply blew me away. "Listen, Mark," he said. "This is a tough age for you guys. I know that. I was a kid too one day, believe it or not." His light chuckle began to make my blood boil. I knew where this was going. He continued, "You kids have a hard enough time at this age just trying to fit in. Everyone has their own personality, and not all of them are going to be compatible. Of course, we discourage roughhousing, but it's going to happen. Like they say, boys will be boys." I replied by telling him this wasn't just some sort of roughhousing, this was targeted assault. But every time I tried to speak, he interjected. Everything I said, he passed it off one way or another. He eventually told me I needed to get to class. I tried to continue, but again, he stopped me. He told me he wrote the time on my pass, and I better not get to class long after that time. I was absolutely shocked. This is right where I began to lose faith in humanity. This man before me, a principal of a school, was just informed of some extreme bullying, things that were beyond bullying, and he just blew it off as nothing. He wouldn't protect Ricky either. Remember when I said that schools raise awareness for bullying, but fail to take action? Well, this is when I first began to learn of this. I slowly stood up, speechless, and walked out of the office to my first class that day. The next couple of days, things continued on the same. Honestly, at this point, I just tried to avoid both Ricky and John. I didn't want to be a part of it. I tried to help. I did my part. I was done with all of it. That attitude lasted all of about 2 days, possibly 3. And then I found myself close to Ricky one day during recess. It was a relatively warm spring day. I was playing with some other kids, running around, going down the slide, and toppling on top of each other. I was having a lot of fun. Unfortunately, that fun didn't last. It was abruptly interrupted by no other than John. Ricky was sitting on a bench by himself, minding his own business. That was typically his usual behavior when we went outside for recess. It had snowed several days prior, but today was quite warm, and basically all of the snow had melted. It created a decent amount of mud, but all the wood chips in the play area provided us with somewhere to play without getting too dirty. John came over with his friends and began picking on Ricky. He talked about how all of the other kids were complaining about how Ricky smelled, and that he needed a bath. He said that a giant mud pile nearby was cleaner than Ricky in his clothes, and that he was going to give him a bath. Ricky stood up and began to walk away, but it was no use. John, being quite larger than Ricky, grabbed him and began dragging him in the direction of the mud pile. Ricky did his best to resist, but he was overpowered. Ricky said nothing during all of this. He just did his best to get away. At one point, Ricky slid out of the jacket that John had a grip on and started to run, but he was immediately tripped to the ground by one of John's friends. They all laughed, and at this point, John's friends began helping him restrain and carry Ricky. I felt helpless, once again watching an awful event unfold in front of my eyes. I quickly spun around looking for a teacher or a janitor, anyone, but no one was in sight. Once they managed to inch their way over to the puddle, John and his friend Luke began to position him. Luke was one of John's best friends. When you saw one of them, you usually saw the other. Luke wasn't really talented at sports or anything, but he was huge. He was kind of your stereotypical bully-looking kid. Tall, fat, an idiot, etc. And at this age, he was able to play sports alongside John simply due to his size. With the two of them combined, it was more than easy for them to control Ricky like a rag doll. Luke grabbed both of Ricky's feet, while John grabbed his hands. They lifted him up and began swinging him back and forth. They began counting together out loud. 1, 2, 3. I couldn't believe it. With everything they've already done to this poor kid, they kept managing to do things even worse and worse. There was an outburst of laughter from all the students outside. Despite how mean it was, all of the kids just couldn't help themselves. Ricky slowly stood up. He was covered in mud from head to toe. The sadness I felt inside intensified, but it was quickly overran by rage. The next thing I knew, I walked up to John and shoved him. I said, "How would you feel if you had to walk in his shoes for a day? How would you like it if someone did all these things to you?" John just looked at me in complete surprise. Like I said, he barely knew I existed, and suddenly I was in his face. I also believe he didn't know what it was like to have someone stand up to him. I stormed off in a rage, as everyone stood around, speechless at my actions. I didn't see Ricky anymore that day. Obviously, he had no choice but to go home. It was probably actually a relief for him. Things changed for me that day, in more ways than one. I felt like I was reborn at the young age of 8 with a new outlook on life. And also, I managed to put a giant target on my back. I knew that I would be in trouble, and that John and his goons might mess with me, but at the time, I didn't care. I was just so angry. As days passed, I did end up on the receiving end of some bullying. The things John did were pretty minor though. He would pass by me in the hall saying things like, "Everyone watch out! Ricky's boyfriend's coming!" He sure thought he was funny. And of course his friends would always laugh along in approval. Ricky finally came back to school. As I was getting ready to pass by him in the hall, he actually stopped and spoke to me. He grabbed me gently on the shoulder. I turned to face him, and after a moment he said, "Thank you," and then walked off. That small gesture of appreciation was enough to keep me motivated. I did something that took little effort and it impacted someone in a positive way. I decided from then on, I was going to try to help Ricky. If we stuck together, maybe neither of us would be bullied anymore. That day at lunch, I went over and sat down across from Ricky, who of course was sitting at his own table. He looked up at me in surprise and then said, "Would you like to hang out this weekend?" I was taken back by this, as we'd barely ever talked up until this point. I hesitated for a moment and then said, Yeah, why not? I'll ask my mom if it's okay for you to come over this weekend." I specifically mentioned us hanging out at my house, as I would be quite nervous to go to his place. I had always wondered what kind of things went on there. I saw his eyes light up a bit. The wave of depression that he always wore on his face finally seemed to lessen. Only slightly, but it was something. I will admit, I felt uncertain about hanging out with him, but I figured he couldn't be too bad. Maybe he would be a little depressing to be around, but it would be worth a shot if it helped him. When I asked my mom about it later that night, she seemed happy at the idea of me having a friend come over. I spent most weekends by myself as I didn't have any close friends, and my brother was always busy with one of his own friends. Ricky and I planned it out with our parents. On Friday, he would ride the bus home with me. He would stay the night, and his parents would pick him up Saturday morning. The end of the week finally arrived, and before I knew it, Ricky and I were on our way to my house for a sleepover. Once we got to my house, he turned into a completely different person. He didn't seem so timid. I think it was maybe due to the fact he felt safe for once. He was talkative and actually pretty funny. We got to know each other and had a lot in common. He was excited about having pop to drink and snacks to eat. We played video games. Although he wasn't very good, he loved it. He said his parents told him he didn't need to play video games and therefore never got him a gaming system. Although I kind of thought it also had a lot to do with their financial state as well. From that point on, Ricky and I became friends. And eventually, best friends. We continued to get bullied, but we stuck together and it wasn't too bad. We hung out nearly every weekend for the next couple years. That joy and faith in humanity came back to me. By the time we were 12 and in 6th grade, it felt like we had been best friends for our entire lives. Ricky was definitely still an unusual person. He was kind of dorky looking, and the dingy, often misfitting clothes didn't help either. But he didn't seem to care about it, so neither did I. We had each other. One day at school, just as things seemed to be going perfectly, there was an incident. While in gym class, Ricky and I were messing around, playing some dumb game with a soccer ball, trying to kick it back and forth to each other while trying to catch it. When it was Ricky's turn, he kicked it hard towards me, but his foot must have gotten it at a weird angle as it sharply veered off course, and in a stroke of bad luck, the ball hit none other than John, right in the face. We both looked over immediately in a bit of panic. John yelled, "Who the hell did that?" He looked over the direction the ball came from and saw Ricky. He touched his nose and saw the blood on his hand. As he began to walk off towards the bathroom, he pointed at Ricky. "You! I'm going to get you!" he said. And he did. Because from that point on, it was like 2nd grade all over again. The name calling, the shoving, the tormenting. It was an everyday occurrence. I stayed by Ricky's side as much as possible, just like he stayed by mine. We did everything we could to avoid John, but all too often we would run into him and have something happen. For years now, I hated going to school, and now it was even worse. I had allowed myself to become all too accustomed to the bullying. I finally realized this. I'd become just like Ricky. That poor boy that I felt so bad about. The boy I tried to protect. I was him. How did I let this happen? I began to feel the rage and resentment rise in me once again. It was getting towards the end of the school year. One morning, I called Ricky to see if he wanted my mom to pick him up on our way to school, which was the normal routine most of the time, but I only spoke to his mom. Ricky was in bed with a fever. I felt disappointed and really didn't want to go to school without him, but I knew I just had to rough it out. The school year was almost over. I knew I could make it. That day, we went outside for recess. I wandered off by myself for a bit and decided I would catch up on some homework. Before I knew it, I heard, "Hey fag, where's your girlfriend?" I didn't have to look up to know it was John talking to me. He was there with Luke and this other kid, Carrie. I began to ignore him, but he was persistent. They inched closer and the insults continued. Within seconds, I couldn't hear a word coming out of his mouth. All I could think about was the fact that I was the bullied kid now. All these years, and he just can't let it go. The rage grew inside of me, to a level I had yet to experience in my life. I began to shake, and my heart began to practically beat out of my chest. I felt my entire body was swelling up. I began to get hot and breathe heavily, and then I just snapped. I finally looked up at John. He was still saying something. I saw the smirks on all their faces, and the adrenaline took over. I charged at John with every bit of force I could create. The impact of me spearing him into his midsection head first was jolting, and we both went to the ground hard. I could hear him gasping for air, and I knew I knocked the wind out of him. I was on top of him as he laid on his back. I immediately positioned myself up and started throwing punch after punch. His friends seemed to just be in shock. As I beat on John's face, they were just saying things like, "Hey man, stop it. What are you doing, man? Get off him." I could hear the apprehension when they spoke. They didn't know what to do. I finally had some rational thoughts enter my mind. We had drawn the attention of almost everyone outside at this point. I really didn't want to get into trouble. I was so close to the end of the school year. I finally got up and John just laid there. I put my fist up and motioned towards Luke and Carrie. "Do you guys want some too?" I said. They clearly didn't, and both took a couple steps back from me. "Leave me alone or you guys are next." Okay, they said. I looked around. Those who at one point ran up shouting, "Fight, fight, fight," now stood there in amazement. I'm sure they all expected to see me getting pummeled when they got closer to the fight, but it was quite the contrary. Everyone started talking to each other, expressing their surprise. I knew with all the students crowding around us, a teacher would be over soon to investigate what was going on. Just then, the bell rang, and everyone began to disperse and head into class. Still breathing heavily, I went and sat in my next class. It was not even 5 minutes into class when there was a page over the loudspeaker. "Mark Adams, please report to the principal's office." I instantly got butterflies, while all the students around me looked, saying, "Aww." I knew I was in trouble. I got up and started to slowly walk to the door, which at this point my teacher was pointing at, indicating time for me to go. I began to think about what I could say or how I could get out of this. Crap, did I actually hurt John? I knew I hit him several times, but I'm not some big, dangerous person. In fact, this is the first time I've even been in a fight. I got more and more nervous with every step I took towards the principal's office. With a great deal of apprehension, I managed to force myself to enter the office. The principal's door was open. When he saw me, he stood up and gestured for me to come in. "Have a seat, Mark," he said as he shut the door. He sat down in front of me and just stared at me for several moments. "John is on his way to the hospital," he said. "Do you have anything to say about that?" My mind began to race. I could barely keep track of the thoughts that flowed in and out. Is he okay?" I asked. "Well, he has a broken nose, a chipped tooth, and a black eye. And that's what we know of as of now. So no, Mark, I'm gonna say he's not okay." I've never heard Mr. Lacey talk in this angry of a tone. To be honest, it scared me, and it left me not knowing what to say. "What the hell happened out there?" I don't know, Mr. Lacey. I just lost control." "You lost control?" "There is a boy on the way to the hospital. This is serious, Mark. Tell me what happened." "Well," I said, "I was just outside minding my own business. John, Luke, and Carrie approached me. They started calling me names. They started saying all of these horrible things. I tried to ignore it like I usually do. I guess all of my built-up frustration finally came out. I really don't know, Mr. Lacey. I don't." He sighed loudly. "Listen, Mark, you're lucky his parents don't want to press charges. And that's only because they said John has been in your position before, and they know these things happen. Not everyone is going to be so understanding. I really didn't expect this out of you. Not you, Mark. Look, if you have an issue with John, or anyone else for that matter, you need to walk away from them, not react with violence. At first I was planning on expelling you, but the only reason I'm not is because you've never been in trouble in the past. I am suspending you for 5 days though, and you will make up all that schoolwork when you come back, and you should feel thrilled about it. Any more trouble from you, anything at all, and I will enforce that expulsion. You are on thin ice. Go get yourself cleaned up and go back to class. Your suspension begins tomorrow." I was not pleased with what I was just told. If the world was fair, people would realize John got what he deserved. My mom was going to flip out on me, but I didn't want any more trouble, and I knew pleading my case to Mr. Lacey wouldn't help anyway. "Thank you, Mr. Lacey," I said. "I promise there won't be any more trouble." I stood up and walked out of the class. When I got home from school that day, I felt a sense of dread. I had to explain to my mom why I wouldn't have school the next 5 days. I walked in, and my mom was standing in the living room with her arms crossed. She turned around and looked at me. I knew immediately that my principal must have already called her. She was visibly upset. "I talked to your principal earlier," she said. I just hung my head down and waited for the outburst, but to my surprise, it didn't come. I could tell she was upset, and her voice sounded more stern than normal, but she didn't do so much as even scream at me. Of course she told me my behavior was unacceptable, and that I could never again put my hands on someone in violence unless it was self-defense. But she said we would get it sorted out, whatever that meant. I was relieved though. Now I'll be honest, part of me was also excited to be able to tell Ricky and my brother about what happened. I knew my brother would be proud. And Ricky, well, he wouldn't be anything short of elated. The next week went by quick. Although it was a punishment, it felt more like a short vacation. And I wasn't worried about getting caught up on my schoolwork. I was always a good student. When I came back to school, I didn't know what to expect. Part of me was very nervous. I knew that a retaliation was possible. and without all that rage and adrenaline, John could take me out anytime he pleased. I didn't end up running into him until after second period ended. I was walking down the hall, and I saw he and his friends coming down from the opposite way. John did indeed have a black eye like the principal said. He also had some type of white bandage across his nose. His skin looked purple around his nose. I got butterflies in my stomach. Once I realized I was staring at them, and they were also looking at me, I decided I had to keep looking. I needed to look confident. John's friends continued to stare me down as they walked by, but John just stared at the ground. He didn't even acknowledge me. And from that point on, I was free again. The bullying stopped. I once again returned to being that happy, nice guy. Eventually, Ricky and I found ourselves in high school. I had made a couple other casual friends, but still spent most of my time with Ricky. Ricky never really made any other friends. Even the friends I had just really didn't take to him. I'll admit, he didn't come off as a very appealing person to befriend. He was pretty weird and dorky looking. He still dressed in weird clothes that were far from stylish, but he was my best friend, and I didn't care about any of that. Once we were high school age, we obviously started to gain interest in girls. I would talk to girls at my school every so often, but never really started up anything with them. Ricky often talked about various girls at school that he found interest in, but even with my encouragement, he said there was no way he would ever go talk to any of them. There was one girl he became very fond of over time, and really, I wish he hadn't. Her name was Emma. He first mentioned her when we were in junior high school. Over the following years, his infatuation continued to grow. He would write love letters to her, but never had any real intention to give them to her, and always ended up destroying them. He also wrote poems about her and drew pictures of her, but just like the letters, they met the same fate. When he began secretly taking her picture at school, I'll admit it creeped me out a bit, but at the time, I figured it was harmless and he was just in love. When we got to our senior year of high school, Ricky began talking just a little bit differently about her. He told me that once we graduated, he would probably never see her again, and he didn't want to spend the rest of his life in regret, wondering what if. It was getting closer and closer to the end of our last year of high school. I told him the worst that could happen is that she would say no, and if she does say no, he would never have to see her again, just like he said. I actually encouraged him to ask her out. Although she was both popular and pretty and would most certainly say no, I thought that his asking her would be a huge step for him. It would help him come out of his shell a bit, at least break the ice when it came to approaching girls in general. I told him that I would help him through it. I would help him get ready. At this point, we had been best friends for a decade, and I cared about him like a brother. Honestly, I was closer to him than I was with my own brother Rob, mostly because Rob was older than me, and he was actually pretty popular and typically busy with girls or work, so I wanted to help Ricky in any way I could. I decided that we would get him a haircut, and that since he and I were about the same size, he could also borrow some of my clothes. I wasn't walking around in super fancy clothes myself, but my clothes were at least modern and fit right. They didn't look like they came from a thrift store, and that was a big step up. He went over what he was going to say again and again. Eventually the day came. His hair was styled, he was dressed well, and he looked pretty decent overall. Still not a great looking guy, but it was a lot of progress. Throughout the day at school, he had several opportunities to approach her, but he continued to chicken out. Finally, he asked me if I would approach Emma with him. He said he would feel more confident if I were by his side. I told him that would be fine, and the next time we saw her, we were going up to her. My next class ended. I immediately went out to find Ricky. He was nervous and kept talking about backing out, but I made sure to encourage him. Suddenly, I spotted Emma. She was standing with a couple of her friends. We started walking over to her. Once we got close, Ricky said he didn't want to do it. He started to stop walking. I called, "Hey Emma," to get her attention. It was now or never. I began the conversation with her and eventually gave the cue to Ricky. Emma already looked confused as it was. Ricky, while looking down at the ground, said, I was wondering if you'd like to go out sometime." This definitely seemed to catch her off guard. She replied, well, I guess maybe. Can I think about it?" Ricky looked up in surprise. "Oh yeah, of course." Ricky had a lot more enthusiasm in his voice at this point. Before the silence got too awkward, I said, "Okay, well you girls have a good time," and Ricky and I walked off. He immediately started laughing. He was absolutely exhilarated at her reply. "I thought she was for sure going to say no," he exclaimed. He said even though there was still a good possibility she would end up saying no, that originally getting a maybe from her was better than nothing. Throughout the rest of the day, Emma was the only thing he would talk about. "I wonder when she's going to give me an answer. Her and John aren't actually dating, right? They just flirt a bit, but they aren't actually seeing each other, right?" It went on and on. The bell rang, indicating that the last period was over and school was done for the day. That was always such a great feeling. We didn't see Emma after school. We even casually waited around a bit before we walked to my car, but I guess we, or he, weren't lucky enough to run into her. "I'm sure you'll see her tomorrow," I said. "Yeah, probably, but the anticipation is killing me," he replied. Later that night, I was sitting at home. I had just finished my homework and was watching TV and playing around on my phone. A message popped up on my phone from Ricky. He said, "Dude, I'm freaking out right now." "Why's that?" I asked. After staring at Ricky as typing a message for a while, he replied, "I got a Facebook message from Emma. She asked for my phone number. I replied right away with it. I went to her profile so I could look at her pictures, but it's private. I sent her a friend request, but she hasn't accepted it yet. I feel like I'm getting mixed signals, lol. I didn't even know she had a Facebook. It looks like she used her first and middle name as her name, so I was never able to find her, lol." I messaged him back saying, "That's awesome, man. It's probably a good sign, or else she just would have messaged you saying no thanks. And she probably didn't get the friend request yet. Let me know when you hear from her next." We chatted back and forth a bit until I told him I was going to sleep. The next morning, I sent a text to Ricky as I was leaving my house, letting him know that I was on my way. He texted back saying that he had something amazing to tell me. That made me happy. I got excited for him. He was waiting outside when I got to his house and started running up to my car before I even started to pull in his driveway. "You're not going to believe it, man. I woke up this morning and had a text message from Emma. She ended up telling me that she'd be willing to go on a date with me. She said that the guys she's used to dating are always stuck up, and going on a date with me would be a nice change of pace." "Wow," I replied. "That's awesome, man. I'm super happy for you and proud of you. When are you guys going out, and what are you doing?" "Well, since it's Friday, we're going out tonight. We're going to meet up and play putt-putt, and then go get some food after." His happiness and excitement radiated through the car and instantly improved my mood too. I expressed my excitement for him. I awkwardly asked him if he had enough money for everything. He assured me he still had a small amount of money set aside from shoveling snow earlier in the year. Emma is all we talked about until we got to school and had to go to our first classes. She's also basically all we talked about the rest of the day too. At one point, Ricky and I passed by her in the hallway. I looked over at him and saw him smiling at her, but she was too busy chatting with her friends and didn't even notice us walk by. "You should have said something to her," I told Ricky. "I almost did," he said. I choked though. We both laughed about it and agreed that he would have plenty of opportunities tonight to finally speak to her. At the end of the day, Ricky sent Emma a text just to confirm they were still on for their date. She replied back to him, telling him she would be there, and in the 10 years I've known Ricky, I've never seen him quite this excited. Ricky still had the outfit I let him borrow. I told him to make sure he washed the clothes and wore that outfit to the date, and also to do his hair the way I showed him. I dropped him off at his house, wished him luck, and told him to call me later to let me know how it went. I relaxed that evening and played some video games. At around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. I expected it to be Ricky, but it was my buddy Jeff. "Hey, what's up, Jeff?" He quickly replied, almost cutting me off by asking me if I'd talked to Ricky. I told him I haven't talked to him since I dropped him off at school. "Well, did you hear what happened to him?" he asked. "No, what do you mean?" I replied. He went on to tell me something that made me absolutely sick. A little before 7, when Ricky was supposed to meet up with Emma, he got a text from her. She told him she would meet him by the pavilion, which was right next to the little office at the putt-putt place. Apparently Ricky showed up, flowers in hand, and made his way over to the pavilion. He walked around a bit, looking for Emma. Finally, he decided to go sit in the pavilion and wait for her. As he was about to walk in, he was stopped dead in his tracks. Jeff told me that John and a couple of his friends were hiding on top of the pavilion. They had a bucket full of dog feces, urine, and a bunch of other nasty stuff, and dumped it all over Ricky. They then climbed down from the roof of the pavilion. They walked over to him, all hysterically laughing. Ricky was obviously upset and was trying to get everything off of him. Ricky's phone began to ring. Emma was calling him. Despite what just happened, he was so in love with her, he had to answer. He picked up. "Emma?" Just then, John walked over closer to him. Don't ever come near Emma again. She would never date your pathetic ass anyway, you idiot. Just then, Ricky noticed John's voice was coming both from in person and the phone. It was John texting him all along. It would also turn out that John made a fake Facebook profile too. Ricky had never talked to Emma since he asked her on the date. John threw the bucket at Ricky and he and his friends walked away. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I quickly got off the phone with Jeff and called Ricky. His phone went straight to voicemail. He probably didn't want to talk to anyone, which I understood. Still, I wasn't going to leave him alone. Right now he needed a friend, probably more so than he did 10 years ago when he was sitting in that bathroom stall crying. I immediately got my shoes on and raced out of the house. I drove over to Ricky's as fast as I could. I saw his parents' car wasn't there as I pulled in, so I didn't even bother knocking. I walked into Ricky's house, knowing I would probably find him sitting alone, crying, just like he was 8 years old all over again. I began to feel that rage enter back into my body. Man, I wish John was standing in front of me. I would love to finish what I started years ago. "Ricky," I called out. I figured he was up in his room, so I didn't even bother looking around the downstairs. I made it up to his room, but he wasn't there. I checked the rest of the rooms upstairs and then looked around downstairs. I figured he might have still been walking home from the putt-putt place, although it wasn't far from his house. I decided I would drive there and try to find him on the way. I was about to walk out the door, and then I had a thought. He could have been in the basement washing my clothes that had been soiled. I didn't care about my clothes right now, and he didn't need to care about them either. I did see some light, albeit dim, coming from the basement as I began walking down the uneven, creaky wooden stairs. "Ricky," I called out again. I made it down the stairs far enough to be able to see into the basement and nearly collapsed. Ricky's lifeless body hung in front of me, tied to a beam in the ceiling. No, Ricky," I let out. I shuffled down the rest of the stairs and searched for a way to get him down. I tried lifting him to loosen the noose, but I wasn't able to. I frantically looked around and found a small handsaw. I sawed at the rope as hard as I could, and after several seconds, I managed to get through it. His body fell to the cold basement floor like someone dropped a marionette. I grabbed him and shook his body and screamed his name. But it was no use. He was as cold as the floor. His skin had a blue tint to it. I began crying hysterically and called for emergency services. I knew there was nothing they could do to help him, but I still figured it was the right thing to do. After calling, I broke down and sat on the floor, continuing to weep. And then suddenly, John's face popped in my mind. My hysteria instantly turned to rage. But unlike any type of rage I've ever previously experienced, I'm not certain there are words to describe what I began feeling. After the EMS arrived, and I answered all the police's questions, I got in my car. I didn't know exactly what I was planning on doing, but I had to find John. I had to let him know what he caused, what he did. He needed to be held accountable for this, because this was his fault. He killed Ricky. He killed my best friend. I drove to the putt-putt place, but as expected, he wasn't there. I decided I would try to find him at his house. I, like everyone else, knew where he lived. He always loved to brag about which house was his, like it was something he should be proud of, like it was like an accomplishment of his somehow. My rage continued to boil over. I couldn't think of anything else but John and Ricky's lifeless body. I got to John's house, but his douchey car wasn't there. He must have still been out with friends, partying and having a good time, while Ricky lay dead. I parked down the street and waited, and 2 hours later, he finally got home. It was around 1 a.m. by this point. My mom had been calling me, probably wondering where I was, but I was not answering the phone. Not now. I only had one thing in mind. I got out of my car and began quietly walking down the street. John stumbled out of his car. Not surprising, he was drinking and driving. He obviously doesn't value the lives of others. As I was feet away from him, I broke the silence. "What did you do?" He spun around and faced me, obviously startled. He looked at me. "What are you doing here, Mark?" "He's dead," I said. "He killed himself." "What are you talking about?" John asked. "Ricky, you asshole! After your little stunt, he killed himself. You caused this. You did this." "Me?" he replied. "Listen, that guy was a freak long before—" That's the last thing I heard John say. I wasn't letting him insult Ricky, not one more single time. Once again, I found myself launching into John with more vicious intent and power than ever before. I felt the rage and adrenaline flow through my body, and I loved it. I got John to the ground. He fell into his car and was partially sitting up with his back against the rear bumper. I began striking him with everything I had in me. Things were a little different than when we fought as kids. For one, I was more enraged now than ever. But also, John was the star quarterback of the high school's football team. He was big and he was strong. And I mean strong. On any average day, any random person would think I was insane for trying to start a fight with a guy that looked like John. But I snapped. I didn't care if I got hurt. I just wanted John to suffer. With him drunk and adrenaline flowing through my veins, we ended up becoming pretty evenly matched, despite me being smaller and weaker. I did my best to strike John, and he did his best to block my shots and get off the ground. John should have been winning this exchange, but I wouldn't allow it. I postured up and grabbed John by the throat and began to choke him as hard as I could. I wrapped my fingers around his neck and dug my thumbs deep into his voice box. He began to show signs of panic, and I continued pressing down, and everything else happened in what seemed like a blink of an eye. I remember John grabbing my arms, trying to loosen my grip. Eventually one of his hands let go. When it reappeared, it had a pocket knife in it. The knife came swinging at my face, but I dodged it just in time. While keeping one hand on his throat, I grabbed for the knife with my other hand. I desperately struggled to get the knife from him. I started smashing his hand against the other car, over and over and over again. Eventually, it fell from his likely broken hand. I reached for it, and when I did, John was able to roll me over and get into a more dominant position over me. He was incredibly strong. He got me on my side and was pushing down on my face with his hand. I started losing. I panicked and decided I would swing the knife at him as hard as I could, and hopefully I got lucky. I gripped it tight, and as I twisted my body around as hard as I could, the knife hit its mark. His grip loosened, and I struggled away from him. I got to my feet and turned around to face him. It was time to finish this. But it was already done. John laid there, next to his car. The pocket knife was dug deep into the side of his neck. He weakly tried pulling it out, but he was losing consciousness fast. He was dying, and it was clear. I felt the most calm and peaceful I've ever felt in my entire life. Like, I restored balance to a universe which had been misaligned my entire life. I knelt down next to him. He looked up at me, reaching towards me for help, but I just stared at him smiling until he took his last breath. I pulled the pocket knife out of his neck and put it in my pocket. I knew it had my prints all over it. I wasn't dumb enough to leave it behind. I raced home from there. When I got home, it appeared everyone had gone to bed. I got myself cleaned up, laid in bed, and the peace continued as I drifted off to sleep. That peace ended when I woke up the next morning. The grief from losing Ricky and the fear I felt because of what happened with John came racing in my mind. I slowly made my way downstairs, where I found my mom sitting at the table in the kitchen. "Good morning, honey," she said with a smile. "Oh man, I guess she didn't hear about Ricky yet. Mom, I have something to tell you." I began to tell her about the incident with Ricky, about the horrible tragedy that could have been avoided. I did my best to hold back the tears, and then I was interrupted. Sweetie, we've been over this so many times." I looked at her with confusion. "It's okay, hon. I know it's confusing when you get like this. Ricky doesn't actually exist, Mark." What in the hell was she talking about? I began to interject, but she stopped me. "I'll give you the same explanation I always do, hon. When you were 8 years old, you began to get bullied a lot. You really didn't have any friends. So I got excited when you started talking about Ricky. Soon, I found out he was just an imaginary friend. I thought you were a bit old for imaginary friends, but you seemed happy. Even though I started getting phone calls from your principal, he would tell me that you were complaining to him and talking to him about a student that didn't go there, someone named Ricky. I slowly began to realize that Ricky was more than just an imaginary friend. Eventually it got so bad I had to bring you to a doctor. He determined that you had schizophrenia and that you had intense delusions, often to cope with painful situations in your life. When something bad happened to you, in your head it was happening to Ricky. Instead of being the target, you became a bystander. You often would tell me stories that you or Ricky did, but they weren't true. You told me about a fight that happened at school on a day where you didn't even have school. The delusions were powerful and intricate. Eventually, your illness began to progress with age. As much as I hated the idea of putting you on medication, I felt like I was left with no choice. Sometimes you would be mentally present, and other times you were totally in your own little world. But the medication helped. It stopped the delusions from happening. You've been doing so well lately, but when you stop taking your medication, you become a different person. You have these weird, false memories of what your life has been like this far. Some of the events you mentioned were true, while others I know were manufactured in your own mind. This happens every time you stop taking your meds. I should have watched over you closer, but you were doing so well. Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I know it hurts you every time I have to explain this to you, but you will feel much better once you're back on your medication. I'll get it for you now. You can only begin to imagine the shock I felt. Once I was able to get my thoughts together, I asked, "So when I look back on my life, none of it happened?" "A lot of it happened," she replied, "but a lot of it was also made up in your mind while you weren't taking the medication you needed. Here, go ahead and take this, honey. You will feel better soon." I took the pill from her hand and placed it in my mouth. Still in absolute disbelief, I washed it down with a sip of water. I began slowly walking up towards the stairs so I could go to my room. I'm just gonna go upstairs for a bit." "I know, hon," she replied. "I'm familiar with the routine." I felt horrible. I felt like my life was a lie. How did I let this happen? How did I lose control over myself? It just wasn't fair. Ricky and I had such fond memories for so many years. How did he not exist? Was she making all this up so I wouldn't get depressed over Ricky killing himself and kill myself too? Thoughts continued to race, but the pill I took made me drowsy fast. The last thing I remember was laying in my bed. I woke up again that evening. I felt good. Although foggy from the medication and just waking up, I also felt this sense of clearness. I went and talked to my mom. She confirmed that our conversation earlier in the day actually happened. I began to put things together. My thoughts actually felt rational again, even though I didn't know they weren't at one point. I really did feel better, just like my mom said I would. I was just relieved. I felt relieved that my friend didn't kill himself, even though that meant I didn't have that special person in my life to begin with. More than anything, I was relieved I wasn't a damn murderer. I felt like I could accept how messed up I was, and that my life was going to be good from here on. My mom and I finished talking. I gave her a hug and told her I was going upstairs to play video games. "Okay, honey, I'll be up in a bit gathering clothes so I can finish the laundry." "Sounds good, Mom," I replied. I jogged up the steps and headed into my room. I started up my PS4 and began to gather up my dirty clothes for my mom so I could throw them in the basket. I took my belt out of my jeans, removed my wallet, and checked my pockets. I felt something weird in my jeans. I fished it out of my pocket. I stood alone, in my room, while the universe began to swallow me, as I looked down at John's bloody pocket knife, resting in my hand.